this computer. Now it is recording. So it's about context. And I have one example which is fun. Actually, I found this for building systems. How many colors do we have in the spirals? Or main colors? I would say 3 colors: pink, bluish, and greenish. More or less, right? Do everybody see 3 colors? Well, if you see the detail, you have orange, magenta, and so on. But the big spirals, the orange is there, but it's a counter spiral, right? The spiral is in this direction. Let's see. The big spirals in this direction. I see green, pink, and blue, right? Everybody sees more or less like me. Most standard vision, if you don't have any kind of issue with colors, you see it. Actually, there are only 2 colors. This green and this blue are the same color. But the context, here it is intersecting with orange, here it's intersecting with magenta. So exactly the same background, we see in this case blue, in this case green, but it is the same color. That means our brain, our eyes perceive the exact color, but our brain processes it based on the context, which is something we call optical effect, or tricking our senses, but actually it's important labor of our brain to interpret depending on the context. And the context is the key word. There is an important professor of Bauhaus. You studied Bauhaus, right? 1930s School of Design in Germany. Gropius, Mies van der Rohe were the directors. And then you had many artists like Paul Klee, Kandinsky. One of the guys was Joseph Albers. I think, I'm not sure of the T. He published many things, and actually it's interesting artist, perception of color, I think. Color. And he was experimenting with this different ways we perceive the same color in different contexts, right? This slide is taken from a Japanese professor, Yoshimoto. He has a homepage full of all those optical effects. It's a full catalog, right? He teaches at Ritsume University, which is in Osaka. One more example. Not the colors, but the darkness or lightness is also contextual. We have 2 squares, A and B. I think we agree it is the same gray. How can it be that suddenly B looks clearer and A darker? Again, this is our brain trying to recompose the whole image based on the context, right? So the hue, the darkness is also contextual. So why we insist so much? Well, we thought, or I selected this for building systems because we're speaking of the qualities of light and how we distinguish colors depending on the light quality and so on. And the problem with colors and shades is that they're not absolute. When we decide a color for a design, no matter how precise the catalog is, even if we have the same eyes, depending on what is around, the perception of the color, the shade, the gray will be different, right? That will change. Why do I say this? Let's stop sharing this. So almost in terms of perception, all values are relative and contextual. We saw with color. Actually, it's amazing, right? How much things can change. It happens with the shade or tonality, but the same happens with dimensions. Right? Dimensions are always contextual also. And this is why we speak of the scale. We had a short lecture on drawing and scale, I think. You can look back. So this, when we say in architecture, we have a 2-meter corridor, right? This is big, this is small, it's okay. Who can say 2-meter corridor is big, small, correct? We don't know. Depends on the use, but also depends on the context, right? If we are at the exit of the huge opera theater, this is ridiculous. But if we are in our apartment where the rooms are like 2 meters, a 2-meter corridor is enormous. So this is tiny and this is huge, right? The same 2 meters. The same happens with the heights and other dimensions. So first we have standards for dimensions based on human size mostly, right? Not always. For some reason, streets are dimensioned on car circulation size. It's a different scale. This is why the street everything is very big. But for our size, we can check off a chair, of a desk, or a room where we sleep, bed and so on, so we can relate to our body. But except for those elements we use directly, the size of spaces is always relative. It's never absolute, and depends on the context and the use, the program, the relation with the spaces, and so on, right? I don't know if you see the point, because the 2-meter discussion I had with a Korean developer. He did a small tower in Yeoksam, small tower, 14 floors, right? And of course, he had lower part with shops and then the entrance of the building. And in the drawings, I told him that entrance is small. He said, come on, it's 2 meters. When they built the building, he said, oh my God, this is very narrow, right? Because one dimension means nothing out of the context. So if you are giving a too monumental entrance, okay, you have like a maybe monumentality out of place. But if you have an entrance which is just 2 meters, people may not even find the door, right? You have problems circulating, going out and in, and so on. This is what we commented when you walk in groups, right? Just that 2 meters is okay for 2 people walking alongside and probably closing one more. And that starts getting a bit tight. The same happens with ceiling height and so on. And this is where analyzing buildings in plan and section gives you many references. You will see that room heights and widths change a lot depending on the context. And this is why, depending on the building, the door size is not always 2030 millimeters, which is the industrial standard. We have monumental towers with the doors of 2 meters by 90, 25. And they look like a really cat or mice entrance to the building, right? So depending on the use and the context, you need to decide the dimensions. That happened. I collaborated once. I may find the drawings somewhere in one large public building. It was the Chuncheon Namdo, Chungnam, right? The Namdo Chon, the main building. They have the assembly. They had a huge lobby for people. The lobby was impressive. And the entrance to the space was also like the 2-meter door. Even worse, the toilet door was right next to it. And this was a first level large office in Korea. It doesn't make sense at all. If you can go to any project, or you can see movies where you see people going to some kind of assembly, and you see that the doors are monumental, right? Sometimes inhuman. To some extent, you do need the smaller gates, but you will know that this is a gate to a very important place. This is the entrance to cathedrals, to parliaments, even within the lobbies, right? Not just the standard door you have, even in skyscrapers and public buildings, right? So the dimensions, because this is a large public building, so you need to have some kind of consistency with the scale, right? Things will look out of place. And of course, the position of the toilet next to the main entrance is almost ridiculous. It's like a kind of bad joke. Okay, something I wanted to explain. You understand it? So always understand things in context. And this is the kind of things you learn by watching, analyzing, and seeing how buildings are not just a few axes or areas or zonings, not annotating all the dimensions, but understanding how buildings are proportioned, right, and how they're organized. Okay, let's go back to lecture. Oh, not this one. Okay, we can have MEP resting, and now we go to short talk on design process. This was shown in Studio 1 and 2 to show the process. This is a small museum. Actually, it is museum and a house, which is very similar to the projects we were doing in Studio 2 at the time, which were a gallery with a housing. The illustration is part of the presentation panel, in which we have section, perspective, interior, exterior, landscape, and the reflection is a Palladium villa, which is inspiration of the building which is in the top, right? So there's a lot of information put in a poster, which is a very elaborate hand drawing. This is something which was developed between 1975 to 80, about, or even before 1970 to 78 or so on. It's quite old project, but interesting. Again, don't get obsessed to analyzing always the latest. So this is a building which can qualify as postmodern, but that's kind of anecdotic, right? What we want to learn is the design process, the logic of the articulation or the connection of the spaces from the exterior to the interior, and the sequence of spaces within the building, how you implement the program, and how you give shape to the project, which is what you are trying to do. That's independent of the style, right? And 1970 or 870 or 1570 should not be worse. The question is the quality of the architecture. In this case, I was lucky because I could go to the archive of Professor Koyama, was my professor, you know, and he was kind enough to let me one full morning looking and messing around all his archives. So I chose 2 projects, and this was one of them. To start, well, I think the only guy who can read Latin correctly is Professor Fabio. Faior ergo sum. This is a motto which, if you translate, you can say, I fail, therefore I exist. And this is St. Augustine. Right? This is 4th century, 3rd, 4th century. So it's a long time ago. And I was educated in an Augustinian school. So I had St. Augustine up to my bones, right? But the question is, this is like a very modern statement. Actually, you have the Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am, I exist. The famous statement was like a many centuries earlier done by Augustine. And the question is, being able to fail, right? To have failures is what makes me human, because only God is perfect. Right? If you think you don't fail, you are trying to be God, and that's not the job of humans. Of course, failure gives you the opportunity to correct and improve, and this is what we become better, right? And we get closer, in that case, to perfection, to God, whatever you want. But having that final perception as a kind of initial objective just makes you inhuman, and you lose actually the joy of life because of that stress of being perfect. And this is one of the reasons of the no eraser, right? And this is what actually summarizes the process of project. The process of design is getting wrong one time after the other. It's what we say, try and failure, right? Because nothing is fixed. Almost nothing is fixed. You have to find out. But this is what narrows the options and lets us proceed. So you have to lose that kind of anxiety against errors, mistakes, right? Because that's our life. To learn to ride a bicycle, you have to fall down quite a few times and have scratches and bumps and so on, right? Children, to learn to walk, they spend months just falling down and trying to move until they find their way of walking. The children who have this panic for not falling are the ones who take longer actually to walk, right? So if we go to Hegel, which is one of the fathers of modern philosophy, it's the same. You have to be brave to commit mistakes, right? It's what we makes us human. We could have endless quotations, but those two are great, I think, and inspiring, because again, they summarize what is design about. And I add one more. It's a bit pretentious to be next to Hegel and Agustinus, but remember, you know why. If you erase everything, you lose your process, you lose your history, and you need to see your choices. The moment you make lines, one line is a first trial. The second line may be better, maybe worse. And you have to see all those options, right, as you think. If you erase the ones you think they are wrong, your memory is cleared. And we said before also that humans, our existence is our memory. It's not the present, right? So we are the memory of ourselves, but we remember of what we did. If we keep erasing, we have no memory anymore. Again, we are not human anymore. Okay, enough for philosophy. This nice guy is Professor Koyama. That photo is already over 10 years. It is his office. On the back, it is some of his drawings. He has very good relation with convents and churches and so on. So he did a lot of church design. It's all pencil drawings. And in this room, I stayed one full morning just looking at all the sketches. Koyama comes from a context, of course, in which drawing was extremely important, right? Same as myself, but it's a generation before. So Kikutake, one of his professors, is famous for his great sketches. And this is one example. This is one proposal for a city on the sea, floating city. Some of those idealistic urban visions Japanese did in the 1950s and 60s, probably more the 60s, right? Which demonstrates the ability to create a full scenario in a few lines. And also to be really good at diagramming and showing ideas in a graphic way. This is the kind of images or the process I tell you in which drawing or explaining things by drawing should be a priority before writing, right? There's one example of that. You don't need to go to Norman Foster. Actually, there are great amount of architects who are really great or good in sketching and diagramming. The other professor of Koyama was Louis Kahn. He went to Philadelphia and he was lucky to spend a few years with Louis Kahn and Robert Venturi. So they were, Venturi is older than Koyama, but still that care, of course, for architecture as the reality of the building with the material, the light, and the use, but the way of using drawing to visualize that and to give shape to that. Totally different from that kind of diagrammatic, abstract drawing, which is too much symbolic, which does not makes us closer to the future built reality. And well, this is one of Koyama's watercolors. I don't know what is this, but the photo of it was nice. It was in the collection. So when you draw what you care about the texture, the landscape, the shades, the depth, the material, you're really getting the feeling of the building itself, right? It's like almost touching and understanding the depth, the space. This is the ideal of those drawings. And when we design, the drawing helps us to anticipate those realities we'll create later. Of course, that all comes from an experience of building. So the spaces we produce are just an elaboration of the spaces we know. We hear often, you have to dream, right? Dream your design. And I totally agree. You have to dream, but if you forget design, human dreams are made of memories, right? You dream what you remember, then the mind recomposes and combines things. If your architectural experience is very poor, your dreams will be also very poor. So you have to dream. We often get nightmares of design because that dream is based on a very poor vital experience. When we cannot visit all the buildings, we can still go to the books, to the illustrations, to the photos, to the publications, and use our imagination to recompose those buildings. And that's perfectly okay. We have the case of Carlos Scarpa. He literally ate the books of Frank Lloyd Wright. What black and white books, and he redrew, he analyzed, he made the perspectives. I don't know if he made models or not, but his vision of architecture was just studying those books. Then when he got money, he went to the States and he saw the buildings, the real buildings. I saw, what the heck? This guy has no sense of color at all. Those Americans are so primitive. So material, space, light was great, but just a black and white let Carlos Scarpa make his own interpretation of the reality. And he would say, I love white so much, right? That's why I use white whenever I can. But he died early. But okay, this is interesting, right? The dreams depends on your memories. So you have to build that memory as much as you can from reality or from publications. So just by mistake, you produce something different, but still creative and great. So one thing I want to stress, that this postmodern glory, the glorious time, was mostly after 1980. I don't know if you know any of those buildings. Can you say the architect of the left building? This was like the top in the world in 1982, 83. Anybody? Probably. It was like the top star at the time. Actually, a Pritzker Prize. Michael Graves, which probably means nothing to many of you. And that tells you how short are trends and how volatile is fame. This is why I try to warn you against trends and the latest and the fame. Many things remain. And actually, this is Portland public service buildings, public building. One of the most published, most imitated, most celebrated, I don't know, could be like our DDP in Seoul, but even more glorious. Of course, with plenty of practical problems. But at that time, it was the top. Now I wonder if anybody takes it seriously. Curiously, if you say the design, you will understand a lot of design in Korea of the 1990s and even the early 2000s, because this language you find in many buildings like 10, 20 years later. right? This other is, I think, Tsukuba University by Arata Isozaki, which for many years, until the rise of Toyo Ito and then later Sanaa, Arata Isozaki was the idol of Japanese architecture, right? And there's a connection. Arata Isozaki was a bit more practical, but yet you have a Palladian Baroque details and a bit more abstract detailing and so on. So that became trendy in 1980s, right? But we're speaking of a project which is done before this trend was so mainstream. So we have to see things in context again, in terms of a style. But well, if you didn't know about Graves and Isozaki, you should. So, and actually Michael Graves, I was never a fan of himself, but it's an interesting guy. And okay, if he got a Pritzker Prize, should be for some reason. So what I have is just a collection of sketches of the project of Yoshimoto Museum. And this is the first page of the sketchbook. I don't know if this was the sketch because I had the opportunity to have all the drawings, but Professor Koyama was away and he didn't have time to comment one by one with me. So we have to interpret based on the drawings. See, the first sketch is elevations, plans, right? And some image. But we can start understanding intentions. So we see square site, how to put the building related to the open space. It's a cross building. Of course, it is classical. If we have a centralized vision, if we have a bit more sighted vision, some image which reminds us to Robert Venturi and very basic architecture. Okay, starting the first ideas and short annotations. So our job is not writing, but there's always keywords and ideas who are there, right? Then I think it's like those moments in which you don't know what to do, so just draw and put in the background an image which is a little bit less traditional, a bit more elaborate. You see the way of drawing. They are not final lines. So you see that it goes down, up. This shades probably is also hiding some straight lines that then become sloped. But you see there's a trend to have a kind of wall, fence, entrance, one reflector entrance on the back. They have kind of layering with green on the back. So there's a lot of thought already in this small design. It's not just a diagram of boxes and walls, right? It's already trying to get some idea of the space, the volume, and that depth we have in real architecture. Let's go fast because otherwise we never finish. And then suddenly it becomes a section. Then you see in very early stage, using the pavement just to have an in-between space between street and the building, suggestion of a central space, like a Jews pyramid last week. And another sketch of that volume in 2 floors, see the accumulation of lines. So it's like finding the axiality, those points, but never fixed. There's not the exact point ever. Construction, image again. And we see probably glass block, large openings, stone or large glass elements. So this idea to use construction also as a motif for facade design. And this is much more than just telling one thing is opaque, one transparent, another half transparent. It's like using materials with different dimensions, different qualities, and put that in the equation of the element you wanted to produce. And some notes about styles. Tudor castles, that's Britain, the French style, Palladio, Victorian, so on, right? Like notes of things which are in his head. Of course, the Tudor style, Palladian, and so on are the things which were studied with passion at school. Even myself, like many years later, already in the 1980s, I had to draw Palladio till exhaustion, which is not bad because you learn. And then he stops designing and he goes into the references. And of course, this time you don't have copy and paste. You have to go to the books and you draw. This is a very trained guy, so you don't need to make lots of analytical drawings, but just by drawing, you start knowing about composition, the small symmetries, asymmetries of the position of windows, the proportion between solid and glass, which is very typical, or perforated against more utilitarian walls. This kind of rotation, right, from the sides with a kind of hinge to give the main facade in which the arc makes the motif of the entrance together with the balcony, a bit more utilitarian and modern volume there. So there's many things that you realize as you draw, and it is your own project. You don't need to show anybody, right? So as far as you understand those things and you see what you draw, you are improving or filling that repertory of images, right, that you need to use. Of course, you see the effort to draw the connection of the building with the ground, the position of the stairs, which is not obvious at all, right? This kind of small level, this arc porch just in the connection between buildings. We know how difficult it is to connect buildings, and probably this is an old castle with a new extension, and so on. These are things you see when you draw, not just abstract lines or just words. It is the reality of the building itself. More examples, and again, you see this already analysis of plan, not just the axis, but those spaces which connect the exterior, this entrance area, basic dimensions, the way the entrance is organized with the stair. Because you have access, but this is more than that. How the stair is facing the chimney, for example, which is an important element, right? All those things together with the image. So you start understanding building not only in image, but in plan, in organization, and you have also an idea on more options on how to treat stairs. Look what we said about the scale. This is a huge arc, which is 2 floors, but actually this is marking one entrance, right? Well, you have another entrance on the corner, which is kind of secondary. But this is more formal, and probably the secondary one is the most everyday use, right? And probably this is what this lower diagram is expressing there. Then back to the project. And again, see, we have this initial transition space with a pavement, the garden. Remember we spoke about this kind of rotating the axis, right? Those turning points, this hinge in the middle. The building is symmetrical, but you have ways of breaking that symmetry. And we can understand there is a difficulty to introduce the parking, to put a stair. And this stair with the balcony, some access, is something which inspired probably in the previous drawing. So you have a very formal core with more informal additions, right? And a very blurry image of the image of the elevation, and different possibilities of that entrance. And everything, you can see that the lines keep moving. They're not exact. This is not just distractedly repeating the same line. So you see that there was a rectangle before, then it comes here. Probably it was the first line, right? So as you draw, you keep thinking. There's one thing, The second thing is that it's not a purely geometry. So we already have an intention of walls, columns, more heavy elements, more transparent, and also openings, and even at this stage, small textures, right, and proportions in the facade. It's not just putting boxes or squares of the program. Later stage, well, you can see how the thinking process goes on, right? Suddenly that back becomes kind of a pavilion or garden, we don't know. The house museum becomes more compact, the garden more elaborate with a secondary node, right? And the secondary platform. The access becomes more sophisticated with the spaces in between, even after the space around. We can have an idea of a structural rhythm, and also some idea of a scale in the windows. And again, we have the fence, the building, and the pavilion in the back, having this idea of depth. See how things are corrected and changed without any problem. If you get the wrong line, you put a new one, and if you think the new one is better, you just make it thicker until you cannot draw anymore. See also the notations with the dimensions. Even at this stage, we always keep checking the dimensions are right. Of course, in terms of the building fitting on the site, but to have some kind of understanding of what we are doing. Suddenly, a more simplified element. At some point, the building becomes kind of cube with 4 columns in the middle, right? Stair, doubting the stair outside, inside, putting a growth or something more organic, to have an in-between space, to have a parallel stair. Again, interesting way to tweak the entrance, right? So even though you have an axis, you have to move and go back with actually a secondary entrance, which is something which already comes from those examples we saw, right? A very clear formal entrance, but close by mysterious secondary entrance with the small things happening around. Alternatives for the stairs, some idea for the garden, and you see again dimensions and how this may translate in terms of image, dimensions, and so on. You see that there is already quite a lot of change, but the idea, the pursuit of this kind of a classical, modern, compact, formal, informal element is the same, right? It's not changing radically the design at every step, right? See how even in this sketch, we have an idea of what is the thick walls, the rigid elements, the windows, and so on. Again, notes, right? And we have suddenly Le Corbusier, and so on. English mixed with Japanese. Actually, Koyama always writes by hand, so I had a very nice time decoding his handwriting. And then organizing the thought again, mixing the styles. I'm back now to study Palladio, right? So it's like taking a rest. The initial sketches were like a British Tudor style. Suddenly the element becomes cubic and more symmetrical. And then, okay, let's see Palladio and how he works, the building related to the garden, but also the internal organization of the building, those intermediate spaces, like those arcades, right? Those side pavilions, and the more formal element, or urban palaces. Plan, elevation, sometimes section, So you see examples of buildings which were similar and actually very well controlled, right? It is a Foscari, one of the famous Malcontenta, one of the smaller villas also. So you see all the variations on large, small, more formal, more informal, which are the things actually the project is looking for. And then at some point, well, still more abstract, you see at some point the drawing becomes faster because now it's going for very specific elements of the design. The famous Rotonda and the Basilica in Vicenza, this fantastic building. This is a renovation, actually. It was a Gothic kind of marketplace, right, with enclosed space in 2 floors, I think. And Palladio did an extension with a classical second envelope outside, which is this element, which helped to reinforce this building, give more stability, but to have more space for those shops. And it was the model for the now called Palladian window, right? Which is this is called the Basilica in Vicenza. If you're not familiar with it, be familiar with it because it's important. And the most close to it, it is the San Marco Square. I think it's San Sovino. I'm not sure about it. But, which has a bit more stylized and not as classical relaxed style or proportion as Palladio. Because it's all Venice, but Vicenza, Palladio, and Sansovino have different character. Well, Orban Palace, I think it's a Chiericati. Yeah, Chiericati. Interesting palace because everything all is void, right? Only one small part of it is solid. So it's all porticos against the city. One idea you could explore actually is very modern. For example, Tegon, instead of columns, you could work with arcs, but with void spaces and to have this kind of a second layer transparency, or maybe. And the use of those transitional elements to go to the backyard, right, from the street and so on. So you see the layering of the spaces and space becoming narrow, wide, open to the square. So even in a very simple and very small building, you have a very rich experience of passing by. Well, perspectives and more detail of specific usage. So surely it was an interest to have 2 classical columns with overlap of the arc and the smaller scale. That is the triumphal arc, whereas in the upper floor becomes a bit more informal, and the attic is almost a functional building. More urban palaces, but again with a sequence of courtyards. It's also annotated as Palladio. Then the churches. And then back to the project. This is already the sketch for the preparation of the panel. Since those panels are done by hand, you need a lot of preparation. So it's like same possibilities. The building right now is kind of 9 squares. So using this as a compositional theme to show the space with kind of more free gesture, which is, this is near some water body. So this idea of water, right? Or having a longer vertical composition, which you have a plan, section elevation, and some views with this kind of crossing. This idea we saw at the beginning of showing the interior, exterior broken, and then the plan together. that planning of how you will present, right, to show as much as you can, as clear, as attractive in only one sheet is the exercise you have to do for your final panel, right? And sometimes we put too much information and too improvised, and things not provide a strong vision of the building, as in this case it happens, right? Because we have so many materials and so precise that we stuff everything in the panel, and it becomes like a small compressed book of the building, not really a presentation panel. So that ability, or that intention at least, or that planning ahead, I think something we are in danger of losing. And this is the sketches of those individual parts of the panel. And then back to the design measures, and you see now it is like solving the design itself, the right size of the rooms, how the entrance results, right? How we can put a secondary stair, and so on. And see that suddenly, well, it was closing here, but it becomes larger, so it is common space and so on. This is real thinking drawing. And then back to the images. So this looks very much to the beginning, right? One longer. See, 10 dimensions, and the elaboration of the plan. Again, having the real rooms, suggesting the furniture, using pavement to characterize exterior or entrance spaces, position of stairs, and so. But even being deliberately classical, see how elements are symmetrical, circulation is very clear, but symmetry is broken. You can see also the exterior is very well arranged, very symmetrical, but the building is much more organic, right, and much more free than it seems. This is the game, that balance between being very organized, very regular, but then having some tweaks or some adaptation which break that rigidity, right? So at times you have a lobby, perfect with 4 doors, symmetrical, right? But then each door brings to a different space, and that symmetry disappears. Facades, again, the same game. I think we don't need to comment again, but even in the simplicity, you have right size of windows, partitions of material, large openings, small openings, divisions, connections, overlaps. Back to the floor plan. Here, the drawing becomes very messy, so the yellow pencil helps to visualize a bit more those movement spaces. It's clear that at times you need to study parts, and this lobby, probably this part, right, in which you have one corridor which comes from the center, but others more tangential, right? So you need to elaborate, and it's not obvious. So as you draw, you keep thinking, and there are plenty of those, right? With small changes, treating different things, but already with a clear intention. And as you proceed, you get more detail because you know better what you are doing, right? We see already furniture, we see a more clear position of the stairs, a bit more in purpose design of the texture of floor, and so on. Again, grid for structure and circulation, and then back to the site, and Palladian again, trying to simplify because at some moment it seems there was too much complication. This is looking back, and you see 9 squares. What if we just make the cross, make everything a bit lighter? So back to the 9 squares, the cross. At some point, suddenly we have the exhibition display elements, the dimensions, right? And probably in parallel, the staff in the office was doing scale drawings and models and so on. Stages of light. So at this moment, there's kind of very clear idea of how things work, but see how the drawing is quite open, right? Things are not finished, and there's not any design or any drawing of things which are not important at this stage. This is a construction detail, not a collision detail. Right? It's about a lighting device. Again, annotations, and then a rendering of the first version as a cube. Quite simple in the end. But you see this, and it seems that's a design you do almost on the fly because it's so simple. But you see how much thought is behind, how much elaboration. So things are not mere repetitions. You have some facade without windows, but has some kind of connection with the other. And you have very clear composition, but then the organization beyond that composition is very, very organic, right? This soft connection with the water, this entrance parallel to the building and then rotating, a bit more discrete position of the parking place, the green as a background, and so on. Different version. And different version. No, I think this is the same. This is different version, right? And then in between sketches. And one full proposal, other for a square. This is a hand drawing. This is design drawings. We know there is a structure because this is a clear reference to the columns, but nobody bothers to show what happens inside walls. What you are showing is what happens in the space. See the way of drawing, for example, the bathrooms or the furniture. This is just the detail you need to know the furniture there. Not that excess of detail you put in cutting, which you just copy a block, which is thought to print at 1:5 scale, and you put in 1:100 scale. Those drawings are 1:100, I think. See also the strategy to draw the green, and also the importance of the pavements to give a reference on how the space is organized. Very small building, actually, right? Upper floor with an atrium and the exhibition spaces, and then the top floor with the house, actually, the living spaces. You see that the scheme is very classical, very symmetrical, but the program itself breaks that symmetry and makes us have very nice, clear rooms, but with some freedom to accommodate a program which is vital. So you need a bit more flexibility. And as soon as you have a proposal, the client wants more. So you have the corrections over that. Corrections, it is clearly comments with the client, with the perspectives and the annotations, all those elevations. So nice way to draw the elevations and see how even in a very abstract drawing, you have to show always the ground. So we have an idea of how the building relates to the environment. We're talking, right? When you design the windows on the doors, then you can put them in the elevation, which are not at all generic elements. They are elements which are thought for the building. Minimalistic, just one piece of glass, or a bit more elaborate. Other thing is the design is okay or not, right? Then beautiful section, well drawn, but showing that there is more than just putting rooms around. There's a brick care to have a top light in those existing rooms, and a lot of views and terraces and openness for the house spaces on the top. So you avoid windows on the outside, but you have a great light and different qualities of light and space in the building. Another beautiful section showing the context, right? The access street with the bank to the river, and then the back garden, which tells us we are in a small hill, right? With this atrium, which in the end opens to the exterior and to the main courtyard of the house. So you have a glass to separate, but actually from the house central space, you have some kind of visual connection with the museum. See also how the section does not intend to show all the foundation, because the purpose of this drawing is to show the space, but it gives very thick floors, because here you have the floor, suspended ceiling of the systems. So we know it will be probably 1 meter or more thick, right? Whereas in the roof, it's a bit more thin. Because in 1970, September 1970, I lost the date. Let me see. I know, it's September. So at that time, insulation was not a big concern as it is now. Also, a different version with the garden. Well, see how the stair is very formal, very classical, but at the same time very modern. Those rooms, right? Those gestures which both divide and join and give also a bit more informal aspect, character to the plan. And the museum exhibition spaces and the house in the end. New section. And we have the date, but I don't know why it is cut. I think the original, we can see the dates. It's 1976 already. Another version, right, in which it is mostly pavement design. And then the museum, complex circulation of the stairs, and the upper part of the house becomes minimal and totally change of image, right? A bit more informal, symmetrical, more ambiguous between modern and classical, and those sections. Interestingly, the change of style, probably the staff was different in this case, but this became the standard of Koyama office, right? To make the section showing very much the light, the shade, and the textures of the materials used inside. So this kind of a pure line drawings were very much initial stage. But again, the point is those sections showing not only interior space, but how the building integrates in the landscape, right? Because you have straight floors, but then elements was really open, something in between, and the atrium, which is that communication of that exterior space, right? And then another large space, which is the one that you will show in the landscape, more with a larger scale. And this is not for the sketchbook. This is published. And since this is published, it was not in the sketchbook. So this is the selection of drawings which were used for publication, which show intermediate stages that we missed because they were out of that collection. Now the different trials of the 9-square system and the different sketches giving shape to those elevations. And then this is the set of drawings we saw before, the publication. And this is the final panel we had in the cover, right? Final panel of the version of the cubic building, which is still today he has hung in the entrance of his office. Well, today. Last time I was there was 4 or 5 years ago. 5 years ago, 2016, in his 80th anniversary. This is a one panel. Okay, so it's like a very elaborate drawing. What's the conclusion of that? So when you see those final drawings, you see there's a long process there. And there's a process which is very much focused in anticipating that built object is not pure geometry, it's not just symbolic, it's as realistic as it can. It is flexible, it is changing, but always having a very, very strong objective, right? So you don't get lost in ways which are not the ones. And here there was a strong fight between that kind of medieval Renaissance Tudor British style and more classical Italian Palladian style. And finally, you have something which is neither. It's a kind of modern, postmodern building, if you want. But in this case, the style, modern, postmodern is not important. The important is this working of the connection of the building with the environment, the implementation of the program, the sequence of the spaces, the connection of the rooms, and that tension of breaking or keeping symmetries, right? So it gives us an experience of the building, of the space. Right. Which in a different style is what happens with the Johnson University old headquarters, or Somerset University old headquarters, right? Or artist house, if you want to call it. The style is different, but the play of the scale, the geometry, the access, this kind of flexibility and the formality is present there in a different program, different context, of course, different time, but the problems are the same. Right? So I hope that gives you a bit more context, because this is the end of the presentation. Again, this was just to give you more references, right? And this is one interesting process, I think, in terms of research and the usage of many case studies, which do not show directly in the result, but really help to elaborate it. Any question or comment? No question, no comment? No, nothing? Reference for a sketch, right, for a sketch, but not only for a sketch, the idea of a thinking drawing, right, and the design process, or the process of making a project. Actually, we complain, why on earth have we to talk about design? Design makes us be like a bit detached from what is architecture and think only on the external appearance, the shape, right? And that comes from the English, American system. So in Spain, we never speak of architectural design. We speak of the architectural project, right? Putting more the concept of Wijang. Of course, design is part of the project, but it's more than that. When you speak of design, it becomes like just making things nice and cute and giving some kind of shape. But the project is like making a real building, which includes that part. And Italy is the same. So when I speak with Fabio, yeah, progettazione. Yeah, in Spanish, proyectos, and we translate as project. Not a design, not diseño. In Italian, disegno, right? Disegno is something lighter, and I think the word confuses much more than it helps. But well, we did not invent the language, but the language is important because the words define a little bit the character of the ideas we have, believe it or not. You all speak at least 2 languages, right? But each language, the words to use for each thing actually give you a different vision of those things, right? And I think that choice of a design, which you also translate in Hangul as design, is unfortunate, right? Because design comes from drawing. And we insist that drawing is not architecture. Drawing is just a representation of it. But when you well design, it seems when we have the drawings, we are done, and not we have to make the building. That's the tragedy of architecture. We cannot make buildings before we graduate, so we have only the experience of doing, and that has to push us to exercise more our imagination, to have always that kind of the image of the real thing, not expecting the drawing will make it pop out, which is totally out of control, right? So you have to pursue a real thing. Again, if you speak of cooking, I hope you all had lunch. Some of you are still eating. Okay, so when you think on cooking, you think on real food. When you prepare or you imagine or plan one dish, you really think of real ingredients, tastes, and so on. You don't say, okay, Gemini's are hungry, as usual. Okay, we will finish soon. So you will have the opportunity to have your second lunch or early dinner.
Professor, can I do another question?
Yes, but let me finish 1 second. Don't forget your question, because I was telling, when you cook, right?
Right.
You don't say, oh, I will prepare a dish, which is, you know, it has texture, so you have to chew it. It will be warm. You have both sweet and a salty taste, some spicy. How do you think? Looks delicious. That means nothing, right? You may say, well, put fish and those vegetables, and I will roast with a bit of salt, and they can start imagining what this is about. And then you really create one dish, and you speak of cooking, right? You don't speak about cuisine design. I hope we don't, because we don't design the food, we produce it. And architecture is a bit the same, right? It's not just abstract words, a concept, it's like a real materials, spaces, which we pursue. Abstraction helps us to analyze, to connect, to relate things, but design is very specific, right? Sorry, Junhyun, I was going to forget what I wanted to say. I hope you didn't forget your question. What is it?
So it is about our first short talk about context.
Yes.
So there are many things to consider for context. In that, one of that is buildings near the site.
Yes.
And do we have to consider the interior of that buildings? Because as for example, we have kind of monumental buildings on the site, and they all have some large lobbies. And that things.
Well, that's the principle of the Nolly plan, right?
Right.
Plan of Rome, and that's a recommendation to take into account. Let me. I cannot write here. So it is a choice of you, of course, but my suggestion always in site plans with context, at least the near context site plan, is to show the buildings in ground floor. So we see how the exterior space and the building relates. See how in all the sketches we saw, almost the whole process was on ground floor, right? Understanding how the access of the building, the interior space organization, that sequence of the space inside and the connection to the garden worked, right? Almost the full effort was in the ground floor. Of course, the elevations for the image, and then sections, perspectives, and so on. So if you put the ground floor of your building with the lobby, and you see the lobbies of the other buildings, mostly lobbies, you may have the whole ground floor, but if you put too much information, you make it a bit lost, right? But just this kind of main access spaces, maybe the main circulation and so on, will let you understand much better how people move around and what's the space memory of people walking there, right? If you really use the buildings. If you never went inside Arco Museum or the theater, that will not help at all because everything is abstract. But if you have already in your memory, you have a much better understanding of the site, right? So that's why, of course, context always helps in many ways, right? And this is why you have to see what happens around the building. It always helps. Not only to fix the access and the position of the entrances and the windows and the openings, but also in terms of scale with other buildings and with exterior space around. Does it make sense?
It makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, let me show you, because also I prepared some material for gentlemen. Let me see if I can find it. For building systems, and I went across 30-year project, which was a Studio 2 in that case. And we prepared, it was group work, the context for a small project in the center of Madrid. It was analysis. Yeah. Let me see. It's a little bit dirty, but let me see if I can share it. Let me see if I can. Okay, kind of. Okay, this is a little bit disorganized. This is a line drawing prepared from the site. So we were working in a site which was here, right? So we drew all the elevations around to have that context. And we were 3 or 4, and my part was this elevation. So this is what I drew with detail. Let me see if I can choose the drawings we show. Okay, so this is the colored drawing, right? So you do the line drawing, then you put the ink on top of it, make a photocopy in a good quality paper, and then with the color pencils, you give the textures, right? So we took the dimensions of the buildings around, the topography, and this is the empty space where we have to make our project. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the project. It was not so good. That was not, in that course, we made 4 projects, but it was full year, or 5 projects. It was not the best one. But that context helped a lot because we had a nice Baroque church, typical 18th, 19th century buildings, and mid 20th century buildings. So you have a context there which was quite tricky. So that helped a lot. And this is something that I wish everybody does in urban projects. The problem in Seoul, in most places, if you throw the context, it is so ugly that it breaks your inspiration at all. So this is the detail of that part. And this is other students' drawings. So this is the line drawing of the other elevation and other elevation, right? Where we have to work. And other elevation. And this was for another design. This was the first project. And this was just writing the project with the remaining. This was my technical drawing of that Palladio Basilica window. We have to draw in axonometric. So I was trying here to see how I could draw all those moldings and columns and arcs before I did the final drawing. So that tells you how important is the context. And we did this from the beginning, right? In Madrid, for example, if you make a new building in a central area, you have to show it with elevations of the whole block in context. So they decide the building relates or not to it. And it should be a good scale drawing. Okay, so that's about context. Important? Yes, important. Let me close this because I have the screens. Now that I showed you that, I will show you the final drawings of Palladius Basilica. Here. Yeah. Okay. This was something that made me long for computer drawing because it was so painful. It was fun, you learn. Let me show the screen. Okay. So this was the axonometric of the corner of Basilica. Right? So these are the things I was testing in that sketch you saw, right? And this is the Basilica Professor Koyama was doing. It's the corner detail in axonometric. Let me close this. This was a first year. This is the corner from the axonometric and the typical opening. And this is the detail of that corner. I was badly scolded because the balusters were all messy and the ionic I did by freehand and they were messy. So you can guess in this drawing, and this was the elevation, treated in different ways, right? And just the contour, the texture, the geometry, and the shades. This drawing took forever. This is A3, a bit more than A3 size. You get what grade I got here in this drawing. 60 out of 100. Almost right. Yeah, it was tough. It was tough. In the end, this course, I ended with a B+. This was technical drawing, and this is the detail of that. So we have this done. So they said, you see, this is not straight. So this is so clumsy, so dirty, and so terrible. So yeah, shameful. Okay. But thanks to that, I am very familiar with Palladio. I have like 30 drawings of this kind, of different villas and so on. But Basilica was the most painful. Okay, that was because John was asking about context, and then Palladio appeared on the way. Let me get out of the screen. Okay, more questions. So hand drawing is interesting, but in that kind of drawings, I wish I had a computer. No more questions? Oh, there's a lot of things in the chat. Oh, Jamin is still hungry. Yes. Okay. So it is almost 3. I think I'm happy to see Yongguk. I hope you have time to do something. So for the pinup, Jungkook, it is okay. We start with you. Did you have time to prepare something, Jungkook? Not now.
I'm prepared.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I think Sarah had some problem of time. You don't need to present now. And I think Usop also is in trouble. So we will have 9 people doing pinup. So I had the presentation order that you may negotiate differently. I will put in the screen. Oh, let me start recording.